Imagine waking up and discovering that half your city has disappeared in a matter of days. In 541, the Byzantine Empire faced an invisible enemy that crossed borders without armies, felled rich and poor alike, and left entire streets in deathly silence. If you think you've lived through difficult times, it's because you haven't yet experienced the first plague pandemic. And to understand why this pandemic was so devastating, we need to go back to the world of 541. The Byzantine Empire was at the height of its power under Emperor Justinian Plague. Constantinople was the beating heart of commerce and politics, a city surrounded by imposing walls, crisscrossed by crowded markets and ever-bustling ports. It was a hub where caravans brought spices from the east. Ships arrived laden with grain from Egypt, and goods circulated between 3 continents. But along with silk, gold, and wheat, also traveled invisible passengers. Rats, fleas, and microorganisms no one even imagined existed. The streets were narrow and crowded, with stone and wooden houses crammed together side by side. Sanitation was precarious. Sewage ran openly. Garbage piled up on street corners, and the smell of fish, smoke, and sweaty bodies was part of everyday life. It was a vibrant metropolis, but also vulnerable, a haven for any disease that found its way there. And that path was about to be silently and fatally opened, through which everyone believed only prosperity would come. The trade routes that kept the empire wealthy would be the same ones that would bring death to its doorstep. And it was precisely through these routes of wealth that tragedy entered. At the port of Pelusium in Egypt, the first reports of a strange disease emerged. No one knew for sure where it had come from. Some said Ethiopia, others pointed to India, but all agreed it was spreading too quickly. Ships laden with grain left Pelusium, bound for Constantinople, vital to feeding the capital. However, among the sacks of wheat traveled unwanted passengers, black rats infested with fleas. These fleas carried the bacterium pestis, invisible but capable of bringing down an empire. Each port stop, Alexandria, Antioch, Cyprus, was a new opportunity for the plague to spread. Merchants, sailors, and animals crossed the Mediterranean, mingling with crowds in the markets. And so, without fanfare, death embarked for the most powerful city in the world. When the first infected ships docked in Constantinople, no one suspected they were receiving not just grain and goods, but the harbinger of a disaster that would forever change the history of the Byzantine Empire. And when this threat finally touched Constantinople's soil, there was no warning or time to react. First came isolated cases: a feverish sailor, a merchant unable to get out of bed, an entire shipyard hastily closed. But within days, the disease spread like wildfire. A high fever would come suddenly, followed by violent chills and a weakness that would overwhelm even the strongest. Then came the dreaded buboes, dark, painful swellings in the armpits, groin, and neck. For many, this was the sign that they had only days, sometimes hours, left to live. The once crowded streets began to empty. Shops closed, ships stopped sailing, and silence fell over entire neighborhoods. Ox carts began transporting corpses to communal areas, while the smell of death mingled with the salt of the sea. There was no cure or explanation, and the further the disease advanced, the more the city became a scene of abandonment. The capital of the empire, which had seemed invincible, was about to kneel before an enemy no one could see but whom everyone began to fear. And it was in this scenario of growing fear that individual stories began to emerge, revealing the human dimension of the tragedy. In a neighborhood near the port, a merchant named Demetrius watched the disease take his wife, 2 children, and the brother who worked with him at the cloth stall in less than a week. Alone, he began wandering the streets, carrying a bronze amulet, believing it could ward off evil. In the walled district, a soldier named Marco returned from the border only to find his village empty. The doors were open, the tables still set, but there was no one there, only the distant sound of carts carrying the dead. And in the damp corridors of a monastery, the nun Helena dedicated the last days of her life to caring for the sick abandoned by their families. Without protection or rest, she washed wounds, soothed fevers, and in the end she too succumbed to the plague. These stories were repeated in every corner of Constantinople. They were not exceptions, they were the rule, and together they formed a frightening portrait of a city about to plunge into its darkest hour. And that darkest hour came swiftly and mercilessly. What had once been dozens of daily deaths were counted in hundreds, then thousands. Constantinople became a vast open-air funeral, Ox-drawn carts circulated day and night, carrying cloth-covered bodies, but there was no longer enough space in the mass graves. Many corpses were left in the streets, piled in front of houses or piled near the ports. The smell of decay mingled with the hot, humid air, making it impossible to escape the feeling that the city itself was rotting. Church bells rang incessantly, announcing death after death. Even Emperor Justinian fell ill, hovering near death for days, and his recovery was considered almost a miracle. Commerce ceased, workshops closed, and even the imperial guard lost enough men to leave sections of the walls unprotected. There was no one to work, no one to bury. The city, proud and grand, seemed to kneel before an invisible enemy, slowly suffocating it. But like every storm, even the plague would have its moment of retreat. And it was at that moment that hope would timidly begin to reappear. And this recovery, without immediate relief, was almost imperceptible at first, as if the city were holding its breath. After months of despair, the death toll began to fall, at first timidly, then more steadily. The cooler temperatures and the very dynamics of the disease helped slow the spread. Survivors began to emerge from their homes cautiously, as if fearing the plague was still lurking in the shadows. Markets slowly reopened, boats docked at the port again, and the sound of carts once laden with corpses now carried goods. But what returned was not the same city. Constantinople was scarred. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared. Workshops lost their masters, and families were reduced to 1 or 2 members. The walls, once a symbol of protection, now surrounded a drastically smaller and emotionally devastated population. Still, this slow recovery meant something important. Even after facing the worst calamity in its history, the Byzantine Empire found the strength to move forward, and this harsh and bloody lesson would resonate far beyond that century. And this lesson wasn't stuck in the past. The first plague pandemic not only changed Constantinople, it altered the course of the entire Byzantine Empire and left scars that would span centuries. With the population decimated, the economy collapsed, lands were abandoned, the army lost strength, and vital trade routes were weakened. Historians believe the plague so weakened the empire that it paved the way for invasions and territorial losses that would have been unthinkable in other times. And more than that, it revealed something that still haunts us: the vulnerability of interconnected societies. An invisible microorganism traveled across seas and ports, crossed borders, and toppled the greatest power of the time. Today, even with all the technology, instant communication, and medical advances, this same fragility remains. An outbreak in a distant city can cross the globe in days. The story of 541 is, at its core, a warning that time insists on repeating. The strength of a civilization lies not only in its armies or wealth, but in its ability to protect itself from unseen enemies. And it is precisely this truth that transforms the first plague pandemic not only into a dark chapter in history, but into a mirror for the present. If this story made you imagine what it would have been like to live in that era, you've already sensed how much the past holds lessons we cannot ignore. And here I can take you inside many other moments like this. But to do so, you need to stay with me on this journey. Leave your like now, because it shows YouTube that it's worth delivering this content to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next journeys through history. Write in the comments, do you think you could survive the first plague pandemic? I really want to know your answer. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with someone you know will be impressed. And before you leave, click on the video that's now appearing on your screen. It will take you to another chapter of the story that, like this one, will mess with your head. I'll wait for you there.